Hi there guys, I hope you are having a good day. Now Anthony Joshua put up a social media post where he explained that a good champion or a good fighter will be able to compete in any era. That is what he put on Instagram and that is what he put on Twitter. Now obviously Tyson Fury is a fierce rival of Anthony Joshua and there is mutual respect between the two of them, but he did respond to that claim and what he said was this. "That's you out of the window then, chump. Great, my ass, you got TKO'd by a chubby kid with 3 weeks notice. You are good at looking good on pics though, I must say, wit woo." So there we go, that is Tyson Fury's response to Anthony Joshua saying a great modern fighter will be able to compete in any era. And I do agree with Anthony Joshua, a brilliant modern fighter will be able to compete in any era. If you look at Canelo, if you look at Vasily Lomachenko, I mean, Teofimo Lopez, if he gets a few more wins, he could be considered as well because obviously he beat Lomachenko. Inoue. So these fighters should be able to compete in eras gone by, and the heavyweight division should be no different. Now, I'm not saying Anthony Joshua beats Ali, I'm not saying Anthony Joshua beats Lennox Lewis, or Tyson Fury for that matter, but what I'm saying is, if they are at the top of the heavyweight division in this current era, then they should be able to at least compete with some fighters back then. Now, that just means that the heavyweight division is continuously staying just as good, if not getting better. I don't think it's necessarily getting better. I think that the fighters like Holyfield, like Lennox Lewis, like Ali, they were incredible fighters. They were legends of the sport and they will be forever remembered. Maybe at the moment, we don't consider Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua in that bracket because their careers haven't ended just yet. So, considering there are still 5 years maybe left for Anthony Joshua, he did previously explain that. And with regards to Tyson Fury and his career, who knows, he says 3 fights, then he says he's going to defend for 10 years in the sport, so you never know. But it just depends, the fighters they fight in that time period and the wins that they get, that will tell the truth about what kind of fighter they are. Now, with regards to Tyson Fury saying that he lost to a little chubby fat kid on 3 weeks notice. Now, the thing is about that fight, is it is very interesting, this situation. I think that it's easy just to look at the result and see that Anthony Joshua lost by 7th round TKO, but there was more to it than just that. The stars aligned for Andy Ruiz Jr. on that night, and I don't want to take anything away from him. It was a brilliant victory and he became the first Mexican heavyweight world champion, so fair play to Ruiz. But in a fight like this, the stars do have to align for the opponent to win, because AJ was a unified world champion, had wins over the likes of Povetkin, Joseph Parker, Vladimir Klitschko, Dillian White at British level. So AJ had proven he was of a certain level. Ruiz hadn't done that just yet. So considering that, Ruiz needed the stars to align for him to get peak performance and get a Joshua who maybe was off the gas slightly or making certain mistakes. That was the kind of fighter he needed in there, because look at the rematch, look at the result in that fight. In that fight with Ruiz, Anthony Joshua had 3 weeks notice just as Ruiz did. Yes, AJ was in camp, but then again, so was Ruiz. He had just come off of a win over Dimitrenko. Yes, he had just fought, but that was the best thing for Ruiz because he just had a training camp, then he went straight back into camp. If he'd had a break in between, he would have ballooned up in weight, even though he was kind of a bigger guy anyway, but still, he wasn't the most disciplined between camps, we know that. So considering that, Anthony Joshua fight coming just a few weeks after Dimitrenko was actually a godsend for Andy Ruiz Jr. Now Anthony Joshua was also hyped up for a Jarrell Miller fight. Then he was talking about, let me sit down with Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder on the Sunday after the fight and let's make this fight happen. But they didn't, they went their own separate ways. Wilder announced Luis Ortiz fight on Anthony Joshua Ruiz fight week. So AJ was at a loss. He was like, what is the point? I'm fighting Ruiz when I want to be fighting Jarrell Miller for one, or Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder, and this guy's just come in as a late replacement. So he kind of lost a lot of momentum in the build up to that fight, considering he had all of that animosity built up for Jarrell Miller. What is also interesting about this fight is Anthony Joshua did not get knocked down by Ruiz until he knocked Ruiz down first. In fact, Anthony Joshua has never been knocked down in the pro game by someone who he hasn't knocked down first. The same thing happened with Klitschko, which does point to one thing, inexperience, because Anthony Joshua in the rematch completely schooled and outboxed Andy Ruiz Jr. Yes, he was bigger, yes, he was 20 stone, maybe didn't take it as seriously as the first one, but that's part of being a champion. Just as in the first fight, things didn't line up for Anthony Joshua, but they did in the rematch. So if Ruiz was underestimating Joshua, then Joshua done the same thing in the first fight. So if Ruiz is going to spin it, or anyone else is going to spin it and saying that Anthony Joshua only beat Ruiz because he didn't take it seriously and he was 20 stone. No, that's not it. Because if you're going to say that, then you have to say that Ruiz wasn't someone that Anthony Joshua was taking seriously, and everything lined up perfectly for him to get the victory in the first fight. Now, with regards to talking about who is the great of this era and what does it take, because that is a very good question. What does it take? What do you have to do to be a great? Because there seems to be this kind of stigma that you can do nothing. You'll never compete with Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Ali. There's no way they can do that. But doesn't that seem to happen with every single era? This era will never be like it was before. Oh, it was never like that. It was so much better back then. These set of fighters would destroy the new set of fighters. It seems to always be that way. Maybe in 20 years' time, when there is a new champion and new fighters coming through, we will say the same thing. That, oh, they would have never competed with the likes of Dillian Whyte, Povetkin, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury. There's no way they could compete with those kind of guys. And again, I'm not saying that Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury would beat those guys. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that each generation that goes by, that seems to be the kind of thing that they bring out, is that this generation would never beat the previous generation because they were just better, their form was neater, and they were just better all-rounded fighters. Now, back then, of course, those kind of fighters could fight many different ways. They could adapt in fights and take on any kind of challenge that came their way. So if there was a fighter in there who was short and fast and good movement, they would be able to adapt to that. If there was someone who would go in and box them long, then they could adapt to that also. But the thing is about this age of heavyweights is they're a lot bigger. I mean, Tyson Fury 6'9", Anthony Joshua 6'6", Deontay Wilder 6'7", and Dillian Whyte 6'3" or 6'4", and he's considered a smaller heavyweight when it comes to height. So considering that, heavyweights are different now to what they were before, just as 20 years ago, those set of heavyweights are different from the heavyweights 20 or 30 years before that. It just changes, it evolves, it becomes different, because that is the whole reason behind the cruiserweight division even being created back in, when was that, 70s, 80s maybe? They created that because there were heavyweights who were not big enough to compete with the heavyweights who were getting bigger of that age. So they would have to go down to light heavyweight, which was way too light for them because they were heavyweights really. So they couldn't go down to light heavyweight because they couldn't make the weight, but they couldn't stay at heavyweight because they could not compete with the new style of heavyweights, which were a lot bigger. So the cruiserweight division was formed so that those fighters could slot in there, in between weights. Considering that, I believe that we have to focus on the fights that can be made during this era. It's always fun to speculate with a fantasy matchup like Tyson Fury versus Lennox Lewis, or AJ versus Lennox Lewis. That's fun to speculate about, but the only thing we can do is focus on the fights that can be made today. That is what will determine whether AJ's are great, whether Tyson Fury's are great, whether even Dillian Whyte, Deontay Wilder, Alexander Povetkin, those kind of guys, Joseph Parker, Michael Hunter even maybe, who's lurking in there somewhere as well. So those guys need to prove that they are a great of this era. The only way they can do that is by fighting the best of their current era. Like Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua, like even a Dillian Whyte versus Alexander Povetkin, a Joseph Parker getting in there with the likes of Luis Ortiz or Andy Ruiz. Those kind of fights, that will determine who is the great of this era, because it's not about who was the great of the last era and comparing them to this one. They don't necessarily need to be better than Lewis, they don't necessarily need to be better than Ali. They just need to be better than the fighters of this era. That will determine whether they are a great or not. Not necessarily because they weren't as good as this guy or that guy. Now, obviously what Tyson Fury was explaining is Anthony Joshua can't be really considered as a great because he lost to a fat little kid on 3 weeks notice. That's basically what he is saying. So because AJ lost to Ruiz, he can no longer be considered as a great of this era. Is that what Tyson Fury is saying? Because I think that there are many other fighters who have suffered losses and has still come back. AJ regained his titles in the rematch. He's defended his titles and he has been in 2 unification fights during his career. So I think that he's done well already, but there are still some big fights that will cement him as a great of the sport. Not comparing him to fighters gone by, but of the fighters that are around now. That is the important thing. And even back then, Lewis won against the likes of Vitaly Klitschko, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield. He beat those guys, but he lost to Hasim Rahman and Oliver McCall. Lennox Lewis would never lose to those guys on his best day. In fact, he rematched both of them and beat both of them conclusively. So considering that, does Lennox Lewis losing to the likes of Hasim Rahman and Oliver McCall make him no longer a great, or he cannot be considered within those talks because of those losses, even though he rematched and won in those fights? And look at Lennox Lewis's resume. All the greats will lose. I mean, no fighter is going to go through their career undefeated, fighting the best back-to-back continuously. If they do, then they truly are something special. I mean, Floyd Mayweather has done it, but who else has done it? Who else has fought the best of their era, the best in each and every weight class that they fight in, continuously back-to-back, and remained undefeated? It doesn't happen all that often. Because if a fighter constantly chooses the toughest fight that they can get, like AJ does, then they are going to come unstuck at some point or another. And when they do, those downfalls will not count towards whether they are a great or not. What will count towards whether they are a great or not is whether they come back and win, and what they do after that loss. That is what makes a great fighter, if they are able to lose and still come back. That is what makes a great fighter. And as I said, it's not necessarily about whether Anthony Joshua or Tyson Fury would beat the fighters of the past era. It's whether they beat the fighters of this era, the best fighters that they can, like the Povetkins, like Deontay Wilders, Dillian Whites, those kind of fighters, Alexander Usyk. Those are the important fights for Anthony Joshua, for Tyson Fury, fighting one another. That is what will determine if they are a great in boxing, a legend. It doesn't matter if they would or wouldn't beat the fighters of the past era, because they are never going to fight them. So the important thing is that they fight the crop of heavyweights in their era. And hopefully we get to see the best of the very best, which would be Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury for the Undisputed Championship. And now that is a history-making fight. So hopefully that one happens next, and we will truly find out in the ring. Guys, anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a thumbs up, and subscribe if you are new. Thanks guys.